"Mum, can you hear me?" A faint voice came through the phone at 2 a.m. In the stillness of a rainy night, it froze the mother in place. It had been 5 years since the child vanished without a trace. Everyone believed the boy was gone for good. The mother had learned to survive by living in silence, until that voice dragged everything back. Just one brief phone call. But it was enough to rekindle a hope the world had long abandoned. And from that moment, a journey began. One that led not only toward the light, but also to a truth no one dared to imagine. "I can go by myself, Mum. I'm not a little kid anymore," Ethan called out, one hand tugging his backpack strap over his shoulder, the other swinging a red toy phone that dangled from the zipper. He stood in the doorway, his red knit hat slightly crooked, like he was ready to sprint across the world. In front of him, morning light slipped through the maple leaves, casting a patchy golden strip across the porch steps. The air was cool and smelled faintly of damp grass. Sarah stood framed in the doorway, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, eyes fixed on the boy. Her cheeks were slightly swollen from lack of sleep, her hair loosely tousled, but her gaze was clear and achingly tender. At her feet, their chubby cat, Peanut, lay sprawled, barely flicking an ear at Ethan's voice. "You're only 7, Ethan." "7 is still a kid," she said gently, then sighed. "I can pick you up early today, just to be safe. But I know the way." He turned around, speaking louder now, stepping up onto the porch ledge. "I'll take the path by the park. There's a police officer there, and you said today was the day to try letting me go by myself." Sarah glanced at the kitchen clock, 7:10. Exactly 20 minutes left to make it to the library. Her mornings always began with cataloguing old books, a dull task, but it kept her mind from wandering. She looked back at Ethan. His silver-grey sneakers were a little crooked, one sock higher than the other. His hand gently clutched the red toy, always hooked to his backpack, a pretend way of calling Mom whenever he missed her. A quiet pause passed between them. Sarah lowered her voice. "Just for today. Call me right after school. No changing routes, no detours, no running. Deal?" "Deal. I promise." Ethan nodded eagerly, then raised 2 fingers to his chest, drawing a shape like a superhero. Super Ethan never breaks a promise. Sarah let out a soft laugh, not quite a full smile, but enough to warm the morning fog between them. "Go on, big guy." She nudged the door open. Ethan hopped down the steps, turned back once to wave. "Bye, Mom. Love you." Sarah watched the small figure run along the fence, then disappear into the narrow lane beside Mr. Carter's house. Only after he was completely out of sight did she step back into the kitchen, holding her coffee cup between both hands, as if trying to keep hold of the warmth she'd just let go. 3:12 p.m. Sarah turned on the oven, slid in a frozen pizza, then glanced at the clock again. 3:12. She looked out the window. No sign of him. Ethan's soccer shoes were still on the floor. The red hoodie she'd washed yesterday still hung on the chair. 3:20 p.m. She opened the door, stepped onto the porch, walked down the street. No voices, no familiar shout of, "Mum, I scored a goal today," like always. She made it to the corner near their house, moving quickly without knowing where her feet were taking her. In her mind, one image repeated, a blue backpack and the red plastic toy phone swinging from the strap. 3:37 p.m. "We didn't see Ethan on the playground after school," Miss Alice, his teacher, repeated on the phone. Her voice was steady, almost too steady, like she was trying not to panic. But a few students said they saw him leaving with a group of kids out the side gate. Sarah ended the call, her heart clawed raw. She dialed the police. 4:15 p.m. Detective Reed, head of security. Tall, salt and pepper hair, square jaw, and the quiet posture of someone long used to working in silence. Beside him was his partner, Dana, a sharp-eyed young woman with a quick, alert stride, like she was always chasing signs no one else noticed. "Mrs. Sarah," Reed nodded. "We'd like to know the school release time, his daily routine, and anything he usually does after school." Sarah opened the door. The house wasn't messy, but everything inside seemed to be holding on to a warmth that had just slipped away. On the table sat a half-finished cup of morning coffee. A children's book lay open, its pages bent, Spider-Man's corner folded at an odd angle. "He always walks straight home. Doesn't stop anywhere," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Today was the first time I let him walk alone." "I didn't think—" Dana sat down, tapping on her tablet. "Does he have any close friends? Has anyone been watching him? Any strange vehicles in the neighborhood?" Mrs. Janet, an elderly neighbor across the street, was standing on her porch. She stepped closer, speaking quietly. "This afternoon, I saw a black SUV, unfamiliar. It slowed near the left path by the side gate at school. But could have been a delivery truck too." Reed nodded without comment. He took notes. Then Dana held something up, a red toy phone, plastic, one side chipped, fake speaker scratched. "We found this 2 blocks from the school gate. Does it belong to Ethan?" Sarah didn't answer. She sank to the floor, clutching the toy like it was her child. Night fell quickly, but Sarah's apartment remained dark. The shadows didn't feel threatening, more like a blanket she pulled over herself to hush the hollow call inside her heart. Peanut lay curled at her feet. The TV flickered with the local news. A 7-year-old boy named Ethan Miller went missing this afternoon. San Mateo police are working with the local community to search for him. He was last seen wearing a blue jacket, jeans, and a red knit hat. Sarah didn't hear the rest. Her eyes were locked on the tiny pair of shoes by the door. They still sat there, untouched, as if waiting for their owner to burst through, swing the door wide, and yell, "I'm home!" But the door stayed closed. San Mateo, in the late afternoon, was so quiet, it felt like time moved slower here than in the rest of the country. The lavender bushes behind the library had already browned at the leaf edges, though it was only early spring. A breeze slipped past the eaves, tugging gently at a few faded ribbons still left hanging from someone's forgotten Christmas. In the temporary office of the public library, the old printer whirred steadily. The smell of paper, ink, and days with nothing new all blended into one, so familiar that it was hard to tell where the air ended and memory began. Sarah sat behind the desk, a highlighter in hand, marking overdue returns. An old, worn children's comic book slipped out from the lower cabinet. She paused, looking at it. A chubby blue dinosaur, still bright on the cover, though the edges were dulled and frayed. Nothing special. Just a book. But it stole the breath from her for a few seconds. She filed it into the archive, like everything else from the past. "It's been 5 years." The voice came from Janet, the elderly neighbor from downstairs, as the two of them stood beside the mailbox. Sarah looked up and gave a slight nod. "Yeah. You're still in that apartment. I've seen you. Thought you might have moved on by now." "The apartment didn't do anything wrong," Sarah said, then quickly turned away. Janet didn't respond. Maybe she realized she'd said too much. Or maybe she didn't. That evening, after the library closed, Sarah walked 3 blocks to the old bus stop. She didn't have a second job, didn't date, didn't attend any regular groups. She just went home, where every object stayed exactly where it always had, as if waiting for a small hand to return, and for time to resume without ever having stopped. The silver tin box was hidden deep in the bottom drawer, the one that usually held dish towels. Each time she opened it, she took a deep breath. not because of the dust, but as if bracing herself. Inside were a few photographs. Ethan grinning in a red knit cap, arms around the cat. Peanut. Another one. He was frowning, forced into a stiff white shirt on the first day of school. There was even his old library card, the handwriting messy, Ethan M., starting Harry Potter. She put each item back with care, as if touching memories with her fingertips. The city police had moved headquarters nearly a year ago. All old case files were digitized and stored on a secure internal server. Names like Ethan Miller were now nothing more than silent strings of data buried in a folder labeled Pending Cold Cases. No one checked them. No one asked. No one had a reason to remember. The old clues, a toy phone dropped by the road, a broken camera, a vague witness statement, weren't enough to go any further. A case without a body, without new evidence, slowly became something people referred to with a sad shake of the head. What a shame. Detective Reed, the one who had come to Sarah's apartment the day Ethan disappeared, had since been transferred to internal affairs after an internal probe. Sarah hadn't heard it from him. She found out because every year, on March 25th, she still went to the station, a copy of the case file in her arms, sitting for hours in the hallway, as if it were habit, or a chosen punishment. This year, the one who met her was a young officer named Kevin. His face was still fresh, his skin not yet sun-darkened from too many hours posted at scenes. But it was his eyes that made Sarah pause. There was still curiosity in them, a rare thing among those long used to unsolved cases. "Ms. Miller, I read the file," Kevin began. His voice was hesitant, but earnest. "There were a few things. About a black SUV someone briefly mentioned, and the traffic camera on the next block. It was down at the time, but I don't think it was ever pulled later." Sarah stopped. She didn't ask how he accessed the file. She asked the only thing that mattered. "What do you plan to do with those details?" Kevin looked down. His shoes were dirty, like he'd just come from another scene. He slowly shook his head. "Actually, Captain Joe won't authorize reopening the case. He said it's been too long. No physical evidence, no developments. And unless there's a new lead, reopening it would just go in circles." Sarah wasn't surprised. She'd heard that line too many times. The first year, the third, most recently, last year, from a desk assistant, not even an officer. "I know." She said it softly, as if confirming something that had always been true. "There's nothing left to hold on to. No trail, no witnesses, no body, not even hope." Kevin looked like he wanted to say something. His lips parted, then shut again when Captain Joe passed by from the command room, arms full of thick case folders, his eyes skimming over Sarah without stopping. The silence in the hallway thickened like cold smoke. Sarah had once tried joining a support group for parents of missing children. They met once a month on the third floor of the community center, where the hallway carried the faint sound of someone practicing piano downstairs. She sat in the circle, listening to the others speak. One mother said her son had been missing for 8 years, only to be found 2 years ago. He'd run off with a girlfriend. A father shared about his daughter, kidnapped and rescued after 3 weeks. She was now in college. People talked a lot about moving forward, about learning to forgive fate. Sarah said nothing. She just sat, eyes on the floor, and left quietly when the session ended, not taking the flyer for the next meeting. March 25th. She woke earlier than usual, wiped the table, cleaned the windows, preheated the oven. The small kitchen was the same as always, pale green walls, the wall clock still ticking every minute with a soft click-click. She baked a butter cake, Ethan's favorite. No frosting, nothing fancy, just a light scent of vanilla and a few sliced almonds on top. She placed it on a plate, wrapped it in foil. No candles. Then she opened the fridge and gently placed it on the top shelf. The wind slipped in through a crack in the kitchen window, knocking the wall calendar loose. It fell to the floor, face down. Sarah bent to pick it up, flipping it over. March 25th. Still blank. No notes, no wishes, no messages. Peanut lay still by the window, eyes half closed. Outside, children were getting out of school, their playful shouts clawing at the parts of Sarah she'd tried so hard to patch up. She sat by the window, clutching a small grey pillow. A long while later, she stood up and made a one-person dinner. When the streetlights came on, the neighborhood was quiet, and the second-floor apartment, like every year since, held no voice calling someone home. On the kitchen wall, the old clock ticked steadily, the only sound in the stillness of the second-floor apartment. Outside the window frame, the street lamp cast a weak yellow light onto the bare branches of a maple tree. A stray cat slipped silently across the lawn in front of the porch, its shadow vanishing behind the mailbox in a blink. Sarah sat hunched on the sofa, a thin blanket draped loosely over her, but sleep didn't come. Tonight was like every other night. She didn't turn on the TV, didn't play the radio. She let the silence settle over her like a form of conversation, because in that silence every now and then, she thought she could hear Ethan's voice calling from somewhere very far away. Then the phone rang. The ringtone shattered the stillness like a knife tearing through the fabric of dead time, abrupt, cold, and jarring. Sarah jumped up. The phone was still vibrating on the kitchen counter. The screen flashed in the dark, a string of unfamiliar numbers, no name saved. She picked up, her hand trembling. "Mom, it's me." Just 5 words. The voice was soft, barely more than a breath, weak, hesitant, and so familiar it made Sarah's knees go weak. She hadn't even found her voice before the line went dead. Sarah rushed out of the house in her pajamas, throwing on a thick coat. The night outside her familiar neighborhood felt suddenly foreign. She drove to the police station without music, just the sound of her tires scraping the empty road like the ragged breathing of someone trapped in a dream. At the front desk, a young officer named Mike, on the job less than a year, looked up from his paperwork. "I got a call. It was Ethan, my son." Sarah held out her phone. "I'm not dreaming. There's a call log. Look." Mike nodded, took the phone, but his expression gradually shifted. Wariness, maybe. Maybe he thought she was hallucinating. Maybe he figured she was just another mother refusing to accept the truth. Kevin happened to be walking by, a fresh cup of vending machine coffee in hand. He was the new IT tech, just transferred in from Wisconsin, the youngest on the team, usually assigned to night shifts. He paused, glanced at Sarah, and stepped closer. "Was it an unknown number?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded, eyes brimming with tears. His voice hadn't changed, just like that last day, before he vanished. Kevin took the phone, glanced at the screen. He didn't speak. He simply pressed the Save Number button, his expression sharpening. "Let me check the internal switchboard log. I might be able to trace the signal tower." 30 miles away in another town, Detective Reed was gently wiping his bedridden wife's hands. When his phone buzzed, he almost didn't hear it. But when he saw Sarah Miller's name on the screen, he picked up right away. "I think he called me, Reed." Sarah's voice was choked. "I'm not sure, but he said, 'Mom, it's me.'" Reed was silent for a few seconds. Then he stood up, reached for his coat, and whispered to his wife, "I'll be back soon." Sarah sat alone in the police station hallway, the hard plastic chair cold against her back. The fluorescent lights above flickered with a slow pulse. At the far end of the hallway, the soft crying of a child echoed. A patrol officer walked in, carrying a little boy who had gotten lost, about 7 or 8 years old. The child was shaking, his eyes red and wide. Sarah looked up, and their eyes met. Her heart faltered. It wasn't Ethan. But for one fleeting moment, she saw that same look, that look her son had given her once, the one that said, "I know my way, Mom." She turned back to her chair, phone in hand. The call was still logged on the screen. She pressed replay. "Mom, it's me." She jerked her hand away as if burned. The recording was only 3 seconds long, but each time she played it, it struck her like a blow. She played it again, then stopped, then again, then stopped. Her hands trembled, but something deep inside her began to flicker, like an old ember catching wind again. Kevin came out from the tech room. The call was made from a payphone, corner of Highway 46 and Hawthorne. No camera, no location data. But I can try to trace the signal route, see if anything unusual shows up around that time. Sarah nodded, her lips pressed into a tight line. "Do you believe me, Kevin?" Kevin looked at her, then nodded gently. "Not because of the case file. Because I'm the child of a mother who once lost a child. I know a real voice. You can't mistake it." By the time Reed walked into the station, it was nearly morning. The air smelled of stale coffee, the yellow lights buzzed, the old hallway quiet. He saw Sarah and sat beside her. "You never stop, do you?" Sarah shook her head. "I just never believed he was truly gone." Reed exhaled, his eyes landing on the copy of the old case file clutched in her hand. The file had nothing, just vague witness accounts, an unlicensed SUV, traffic cams glitched out. No DNA, no living evidence. With the new system, cases like that get pushed into the dead file drawer. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "But now there's a call." And I heard his voice. It was him. Reed glanced toward Kevin, who was still working at a terminal, scanning the signal data from the mysterious number. That young tech, he believes. He didn't laugh when I told him about a voice at 2 a.m. Reed nodded, lips pressed like someone holding back something long buried. Maybe this time. We won't miss it. Outside, the sky had begun to lighten. The sun wasn't up yet, but the first pale light was brushing the window glass, and for the first time in 5 years, Sarah wasn't afraid of morning anymore. Early morning. The fog hadn't lifted yet, but Birch Street was already packed with joggers. A dog barked from some distant backyard. A delivery truck was parked temporarily on the curb, blocking the familiar shortcut Sarah had walked for over a decade. She stopped. Her chest felt heavy. She hadn't slept all night. After the call and the recorded message were confirmed, Kevin had texted to say they were tracing the exact location. But Sarah couldn't wait. Ahead was a new cafe. Birch Brew. Bright glass front, white-painted metal chairs, and string lights crisscrossed like a tiny stage. But 5 years ago, right there, a white banner had stretched across the street. "The whole town is looking for Ethan." Now, no one looked at her. No one knew. No one mentioned it. Sarah stood there for a few seconds, then turned away. She didn't hate being forgotten. It was just colder than winter. At the downtown police station, Kevin, a young tech recently transferred from Wisconsin, was sitting beside Reed. They stared at a computer screen, playing old footage from a security camera at a suburban convenience store. Paul, the store owner, was aging but still sharp and had kept the habit of backing up data on external drives. "That's the payphone where the call came from," Kevin said, pointing to the bottom corner of the screen. "Across the street, left side of the frame." Reed nodded. His face lined with age, but his eyes stayed sharp. He'd been retired a year, Yet he couldn't seem to let go of the job that had shaped half his life. And he had never forgotten Sarah or Ethan. In the surveillance room, Kevin was now showing another video. This one from a CCTV camera mounted beside an old woodworking shop, about 60 feet from the public phone. The camera had never been registered because the shop owner had installed it to watch the lot behind the store, but by chance, it partially faced the payphone. Pause. Roll back 5 minutes. Kevin rewound. A figure appeared. Hood pulled up. Dark jacket. Face not visible. The person stood near the phone, left hand holding something, hesitating. Slow it down. Look at the left wrist, Reed whispered. The image blurred, but Kevin managed to zoom in slightly. There was a mark on the wrist, something like a scar, running from the back of the hand up toward the elbow. Ethan fell learning to ride a bike, Reed murmured. 7 stitches, left arm. Kevin said nothing. They stared at the screen in silence for a few minutes, like they were trying to hold on to something fragile, floating in a sea of hazy data. That afternoon, Sarah knocked on the door of a red brick house on Birch Street, Janet's place, the neighbor she'd been close to for 12 years. Janet opened the door with a fabric glove in one hand and her silver hair pinned in a high bun. Sarah. My goodness. It's been so long. Janet pulled her inside, no questions asked. The house was nearly unchanged, brown carpet, old sofa, a few dusty potted cacti. She opened a cupboard and pulled out a tin photo box, edges dented, a sunflower sticker peeling at the corner. They sat down and flipped through the photos one by one. This one's Halloween 2016, Janet said with a soft chuckle. Ethan, dressed as a dinosaur, ran around the whole backyard. Sarah smiled faintly. But when Janet handed her a photo of Ethan sitting on a swing, holding a blue backpack with a Lego robot patch in the bottom corner, she froze. That backpack... I never mentioned it in the original description, Sarah muttered. No one asked, and at the time, I just forgot. Janet nodded. He brought his little wooden knife that day, the one he called his light sword, remember? He said, it was to protect you from the bad guys. Sarah gave a quiet, sad laugh. She gently ran a finger across the tiny face in the photo. Those eyes, somehow, looked straight into the camera, as if they already knew someone would need to remember this image. Late at night. The doorbell rang. Clara, the reporter who had first covered Ethan's case, stood on Sarah's porch. Same neat black hair, same deep eyes, though now they'd softened. She held out a folder. I heard about the call. I want to revisit the story. Bring it back. I don't know if I can handle it again, Clara, Sarah said, unmoving in the doorway. I won't publish anything without your permission, but if someone out there still remembers this boy, we should remind them he was never found. Sarah didn't answer. She took the folder and flipped through a few pages. A photo slipped out. An old one Clara had printed with her 2018 article. Ethan smiling, holding a toy phone. Late at night. Sarah returned to Birch Street. She walked to the old lamp post, the one where she used to tape up missing posters of her son. She reached out and touched the spot where the tape had once been. There was still a faint patch of glue, worn thin with time. A slight breeze picked up. A few dry leaves spiraled at her feet. She took a few more steps, past the sidewalk where neighborhood kids used to draw in chalk. A faded robot sketch remained, blurred and broken. No way to tell who drew it or when. Maybe just a child's game. But Sarah stood there. Under the soft yellow light, she pulled out her phone, pressed play on the saved voicemail. Mom, it's me. She didn't cry, but she didn't hit stop either. An owl hooted 3 times from a high branch, then fell silent, like someone had just tightened a noose around its neck. The cabin in the woods stayed pitch dark, like a mouldy well swallowed by silence. March wind crept through the rusted tin roof, its creaking drifting down to the cold earth, like a morning chant for something no one dared name. Marla Benson, a former nurse now nearing 40, lived in isolation in that desolate wooden cabin at the edge of a suburban forest. No papers, no clear identity, no one came looking for her, and she sought out no one. Rumor had it she'd been involved in a medical accident and disappeared from the city. But only Marla knew the truth. She had vanished from society for a far darker reason. It was her third sleepless night. She sat motionless in a wooden chair by the fireplace, long gone cold, her eyes vacant, like listening for echoes from some distant place inside her head. On the table sat an old radio, the only thing she'd kept from her time living with David. It sat silent, gathering dust, but now and then she still turned it on, as if the boy's voice might come back through the static. "You're losing it, Marla," she muttered. "You're out of your damn mind." A few days earlier, she'd heard it on the local news. The missing person case of Ethan Miller was reopened. Police said they'd received a mysterious phone call, just a few disjointed words. But that name, Ethan, hit her like a blade pulled out backward. Marla knew. She knew everything. David Harper, the man Marla had once loved, once trusted, once shared this house with, was Ethan's biological father. Years ago, David had lost custody after multiple abuse allegations. He claimed it was a setup by his ex-wife. He said every court had gotten it wrong. Marla, fresh from her mother's death and drowning in grief and panic, had listened and believed. She had no idea. Not until the day David brought home a boy with frightened eyes, clutching a toy phone, and said, "From now on, he'll be staying here." That afternoon, Marla went to the edge of town market, one of the few places where no one paid attention to her presence. Greg Sloan, a short, stocky man, with a cigarette always hanging from his lip, once a business associate of David's, now managed the storage shed behind the bar. Greg had helped David with supplies, food, medicine, and was one of the few who knew Ethan had once been hidden deep in the woods. He spotted her, smirked like a fox. "I just need to ask one thing," Marla said, not bothering with small talk. Let's say I wanted to tell someone, would I get in trouble?" Greg glanced around. "Don't think like that. You were there, weren't you? 5 years. I never touched the boy. I didn't do anything." Greg leaned in, voice raspy with stale smoke. "You ever heard of silent complicity, Marla? If you talk, you go to jail before he does." Marla took a step back. Greg grinned, then walked away. That night, she wrote a letter. Her handwriting trembled. She didn't sign it. At the bottom, she wrote, "If you still want to know whether your son is alive or dead, go to the payphone outside town, 3 p.m. tomorrow." She didn't dare send it herself. She slipped it to a stranger through a second-hand bookstore, folded inside an old paperback wrapped in newspaper. The next afternoon. The sun was dry, but the wind sliced through sideways, biting cold. Sarah arrived on time. The payphone stood beside a patch of open land, weeds scattered across the dirt. No one else around, just a mossy concrete bench, and on it, a worn copy of Charlotte's Web, spine torn. Sarah picked it up and flipped open the front cover. Inside was a photograph. She froze. Her whole body turned to ice. It was Ethan, no longer the 7-year-old boy. He was older now, his hair a little longer, his cheeks sunken. But the eyes were the same. Deep, dark eyes, still carrying that soft bewilderment, like he was just playing hide and seek, waiting for someone to find him. Sarah didn't cry, but her hands trembled as she held the photo. She pressed it to her chest, rested it where her heart had been hollow for 5 years. She breathed, but it felt like the air had left her long ago. Far off, in the woods, Marla stood behind the thick trunk of an old oak tree. She saw Sarah, but didn't step forward. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know I should have said something sooner." She turned and walked away. The shadows stretched. She disappeared into the scent of damp leaves and cold wind, as if she'd never existed. The sky was overcast, a thin veil of mist, like sheer silk draped over the edge of the distant forest, where the city lights no longer reached. The rugged trail, scattered with stones and overgrown past the slope, led into the forest's fringe, reachable only by those truly determined to get there. Since the previous afternoon, Sarah had been holding onto an envelope, no return address. Inside was a photograph. Ethan, older now, his hair longer, but his eyes unmistakable. No note, just a blurred ink stamp on the back. Phone booth, 3 p.m. She had sent the photo to Kevin. He and Reed sprang into action, and after hours of tense searching, they traced it to an old public phone near the woods. By then, this was no longer speculation. They had to act, even if they didn't know what was waiting for them. Sarah sat in the back seat of the police car, Kevin at the wheel. Inspector Reed rode shotgun, eyes fixed on a map spread across his lap. "There's only one cabin within a 3-mile radius," Reed muttered. "Only structure still marked on the map, but no registered occupant." Sarah hadn't been able to stay still since Kevin confirmed the phone booth signal. She pleaded to come along, and when Reed saw her eyes, he didn't say no. They all knew the risks, but they also knew there are things only a mother can sense, and if this really was where Ethan had been hidden, no one had more right to be there than her. When they arrived, the cabin was shrouded in mist and moss. Windows hung crooked, the door latched loosely. Kevin pushed it open first. Under the flashlight beam, they saw it. Abandonment, mildew, a silence thick as rot. In a corner of the room there was a faint sound. Sarah stepped in slowly, then froze in the doorway. It was Ethan. He sat in the corner, clothes hanging off his thin frame, skin pale, still clutching an old toy phone, his fingers stiff like they were clinging to the last piece of a world he couldn't let go of. His eyes were vacant, as if still trying to see past the walls, like a wounded animal caught in the open. Sarah knelt. She didn't speak, didn't call his name. She just laid a hand gently on his shoulder, as if afraid that anything firmer might make him disappear. In that moment, all she could feel was that small back, still warm. That warmth was the only thing holding her together. Ethan flinched. He pulled his shoulder in, bowed his head. His eyes skimmed over her face, as if recognizing something distant, yet deeply familiar. He didn't cry, but in his gaze was something that made Sarah catch her breath, because this child, gaunt and shaken as he was, could still see his mother. And that was happiness, but a kind that was already exhausted. Sarah let out a shaky breath, like she'd only just realized she'd been holding it. She took a grey handkerchief from her purse, dipped it into warm water from her thermos, and gently wiped Ethan's face. Her movements were slow, tender, like even a small mistake might hurt him. Every touch was an effort to soothe, to console, as if to say, "I'm here now. You're safe. You don't have to say anything. Just stay here." Outside, Marla was being handcuffed by police. She didn't resist. When Reed questioned her, she said only one thing. "I let him make a call." Just once. David wasn't there. Inside, Kevin found a map, along with a folder full of documents, multiple locations marked, everything from gas stations to points on the power grid. It was clear this had been carefully planned. All that remained was the right moment to vanish. Sarah didn't know what would come after tonight. All she knew was that Ethan was still sitting there, clutching that worn-out toy phone, like it was the only thing tying him to a world that had once existed. She gently wiped his face, like someone shining a small flashlight into a dark corner, not to see everything, but just enough to keep from losing each other again. David was arrested while trying to cross the southern border using forged documents at a federal bus terminal near the Texas border. A brief chase followed when he realized he was being tailed. David ran into a cargo yard, vaulted over 2 shipping containers, but was cornered by federal agents. "Hands up! Drop the bag!" The command tore through the night air. David glanced back, eyes bloodshot, then slowly set the backpack down. He didn't resist. He simply held out his hands for the cuffs, face blank, as if none of it had anything to do with him. In the back of the patrol car, he sat stone silent, breathing evenly, as though still in control of the game. The court opted for a closed hearing, given the involvement of a minor. The prosecution was led by the district attorney's office, while David was represented by a court-appointed defense attorney. Their argument stirred outrage that David had only acted to protect his son from an emotionally unstable mother. They submitted copies of Sarah's past psychological therapy records, shifting blame in a calculated reversal. The courtroom stirred with angry whispers. The prosecutor immediately objected, and the judge had to strike his gavel to restore order. In that small, suffocating courtroom, the air was thick. Sarah sat in the front row, gripping Ethan's hand tightly. The boy wore a white dress shirt, a bit too big for his thin frame. He sat close to his mother, head bowed low, hair freshly trimmed, though his eyes still seemed foreign to the world. Occasionally, he glanced toward David, like a child trying to place the face of a stranger from a faded memory. David was led in, flanked by 2 officers. As his eyes brushed past Sarah, she stood. No words, no steps forward, just a look. It held no hatred, no accusation, only a presence so firm, so unflinching, that he had to look away. Marla appeared next, escorted in from the witness waiting area. She looked frail now, hair thinning, eyes frantic. Her voice shook as she took the stand. "I didn't know it would go that far. I thought David needed help. I was wrong." When David's lawyer tried to challenge her statement, Marla suddenly shot up, cutting off the question mid-sentence. She pointed straight at the defendant, her voice trembling but fierce. "I saw that boy cry, every night. I can't forgive myself, and I sure as hell won't let him walk away from this." Her testimony, though fragmented, combined with evidence found in the cabin, the map, the communication devices, left David with no room to deny. Police also presented recordings from surveillance equipment in the cabin, Ethan's voice repeating the same phrases over and over as if drilled into him. The courtroom fell utterly still. Judge Warren, known for being stern but fair, listened without interruption through the closing arguments. When he delivered the sentence, his voice remained calm. The defendant, David Miller, is sentenced to 30 years in prison for the kidnapping of a minor, the intentional infliction of severe psychological harm, and obstruction of justice. The verdict also cited the indirect involvement of Gregory Hayes, David's old friend, who was placed at the Forest location during the time Ethan was held. Though Greg refused to testify, he remained in custody for further investigation. As for Marla, her cooperation and honesty earned her placement in the Witness Protection Program. She was relocated to another state, far from the shadows of her past life. Sarah didn't cry, but her face was locked in place, her shoulders trembling faintly. She clutched Ethan's hand tighter as the sentence was read, like hanging onto the final thread of life after years of quiet suffering. Ethan, attending his first courtroom session, said nothing. When he saw his father being led away, his eyes rose, heavy with nameless memories. His lips pressed tight, but a single tear slid down his pale cheek. Sarah leaned forward, placing her hand on her son's back, a hug without shape, but warm as a thin blanket in winter. In the cold shaft of light slipping through the courtroom door, she whispered, "I'm here. No one's going to touch you again." No one wiped that tear. No one needed to say another word. The truth had finally returned to where it belonged. The rehabilitation center sat on the outskirts of the city, beside a small forest where tree-covered trails whispered with birdsong each morning. Sarah and Ethan were assigned a modest room with a window that looked out onto a garden of purple lavender. In the first days, they barely exchanged more than 5 words at a time. Ethan would just sit by the window, holding an old stuffed bear someone at the center had quietly placed on his bed. Dr. Rachel, a specialist in trauma recovery, was in charge of Ethan's care. She was tall, with gently curled hair and a soft voice that never lost its firmness. Every morning, Rachel spent time with Ethan at a small wooden table, never pushing him to speak. They would just draw or read stories together. "He doesn't need to be pulled out," Rachel told Sarah. "He needs to know he can step out whenever he's ready, and that someone will still be here." Sarah listened. She started over, as if raising a newborn, teaching Ethan the names of foods, helping him distinguish sour from sweet and spicy, pointing out the colors in the painting on the wall. Each night, she walked him through the corridor, where light poured down from the high windows, to help him grow used to brightness again. Once, Ethan paused in front of a pane of glass and whispered, "Mum, is the sun like a lamp?" The question made Sarah ache and also smile. Lisa, the speech therapist, arrived in the second week. She brought with her a small recorder. "If you're not ready to talk," she said, "you can record what you'd like to say." Lisa didn't push. She simply left the device beside the bed and walked out. One night, Sarah heard it click on. She didn't go in. She just stood outside the door, silent. The next morning, after Ethan left the room with Rachel, Sarah turned the recorder on. Her son's voice came through, soft and halting. "Mum, I still remember you." Sarah sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around the recorder like it was something living. She didn't wipe her tears, but for the first time in months, she felt something warm begin to stir in her chest again. Word of Ethan began to spread, not through newspapers, but through people who had once known him. The mailbox outside the center started to fill with small packages. An old comic book, a note in careful handwriting from a former preschool teacher. "I still remember your little hands drawing suns." There was even a plastic robot toy, cleaned and polished, sent from an old classmate named Ben, now living in another state. One afternoon, as Ethan played with Lisa in the backyard, a black car pulled up. Sarah tensed. A middle-aged man stepped out, carrying a package. "I'm Marla's brother," he said, eyes lowered. "She asked me to bring this." Inside was a photo of Ethan, taken when he first arrived at the cabin, and a short note. "I hope he gets to live a life filled with light. Don't forgive me. Just live." Sarah didn't respond, but that night she played the recording again for Ethan. He said nothing, only looked at her. Then, as he lay down in bed, for the first time, he inched his hand toward hers. Sarah stayed awake the whole night, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, and her hand, so close to his, didn't feel cold anymore. The next morning, Rachel handed Sarah a drawing Ethan had finished. It showed 2 figures, one big and one small, standing in a forest with the sun rising behind them. Sarah looked at it for a long time. She didn't ask, but Ethan turned and whispered, "That's you and me, Mom." In the days that followed, Ethan began to speak again. Not much, but clearer. He would ask Sarah sudden questions. "Is Peanut the cat still alive?" Or, "What was my favorite food back then, Mum?" Each question was like a tiny cut in Sarah's heart, but also a brick laid down, one by one, to rebuild the bridge between them. One rainy day, They planted a pot of mint together by the window. Sarah said, "Plants need light to grow." Ethan nodded, placed his hand on the damp soil and whispered, "So do I." A group of local students put on a small play in the center's yard about a boy lost in the woods who found his way home, guided by the light of the stars. Ethan watched from afar, sitting in Sarah's lap. When the main character shouted, "I'm home," Sarah felt her son's shoulders tremble slightly. That night, in the hallway's soft yellow glow reflecting off the ceiling, Sarah and Ethan lay side by side. She didn't talk, didn't tell a story. She just stayed there, her hand close to his, very close. And this time, Ethan reached out first. Outside the window, the wind rustled through the trees, the leaves whispering like a lullaby. A gentle breeze rattled the window pane, creating a sound so tender it felt like a hush. Sarah listened to her son's even breathing, and in that moment, she knew. There would be no easy road, but they were on the right one. And there was still light at the end of the tunnel. The rehabilitation center, where Ethan was receiving treatment, began expanding its program after receiving a flood of letters and phone calls from families whose children had once gone missing. One morning in late May, Sarah was invited to a press conference organized by the city to thank the agencies involved in the rescue. The press packed the room, cameras flashed brightly, but she declined the invitation to speak. "I don't want to tell my child's story through a flashbulb," she whispered to Dr. Rachel as they sat together in the center's small kitchen. "I want to turn what happened into something that helps others." That same week, Sarah began working with a community lawyer and Dr. Rachel to establish a small fund called Silent Light. The fund wasn't created to retell Ethan's story, but to connect families with missing children and support them with legal aid, psychological counseling, and media guidance. Sarah knew too well what loneliness felt like, and she didn't want others to have to walk through the dark alone the way she had. Clara, the former reporter who had interviewed Sarah during the first year of Ethan's disappearance, showed up unexpectedly at the center. This time, she wasn't chasing a story. "I want to write it again," she said, "but not a headline piece. A human story, if you'll allow it." Sarah hesitated, then nodded, but she had one condition. "You can't use the word victim. My son is a survivor." Kevin, the young officer who had followed the case closely, joined Lisa and Dr. Rachel to form the core team of the Silent Light Fund. They organized private gatherings where parents still searching for their children could come to speak, or just listen. Some shared for the first time about a child lost 10 years earlier. Some came only to sit quietly, but left with a hug. One late afternoon, while Sarah was tidying the bookshelf in the therapy room, Ethan brought her a drawing. "For you, Mom." Sarah took it in her hands. The picture showed two houses, one small, crooked, tucked deep in the woods, with a tiny figure at the window. The other glowed with light, its door wide open, and stars made of paper pasted on the windows. "Where is this?" she asked. Ethan thought for a moment, then said, "It's where I used to be, and where I want to be." Sarah said nothing. She brought the drawing home, to the second-floor apartment where she still lived, now with new curtains and a lavender plant by the window. She taped the picture on the wall, directly across from her bed. She stepped back and looked at it for a long time. The breeze from the open window stirred the edge of the paper. For the first time in years, Sarah left the window open all day. In the days that followed, the center held a small exhibition. No press, just family and friends. The children painted, made crafts, and told stories they'd imagined. Ethan joined in with Lisa. He made a paper lantern, and inside it, he placed a note that read, "I'm not afraid of the dark anymore, because my mum is the light." Lisa gave the note to Sarah. She read it, then carefully folded it and slipped it into her pocket. She didn't say anything, but her eyes glistened. That night, Sarah sat down to write thank you letters to every person who had helped her and Ethan. To Kevin, the young officer who never gave up. To Lisa, who gave silence a language. To Dr. Rachel, who never rushed. And to Clara, who chose to listen instead of judge. On the table, an old photo of Ethan as a little boy rested beside the new drawing. Between those two images lay a whole journey. Sarah didn't know what would come next, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. Outside the window, the street lamp lit up the tree leaves in soft golden patches. Sarah stood there, her hand resting on the sill. The wind gently stirred her hair. In the quiet, something was moving. Not loud, not obvious, but it was light. A silent, steady kind of light. The way love keeps going, even after all these years. One Friday afternoon, Sarah received a letter from a mother in another state whose daughter had gone missing 3 years earlier. It wasn't long, just a few lines. I don't know where to begin, but I read about Ethan, and I don't feel alone anymore. Thank you. Sarah folded the letter and placed it next to the family photo. That evening, she and Ethan sat out on the balcony, the soft glow of sunset warming both their heads. The boy now sat closer to his mother, resting his head on her shoulder without fear. She told Ethan about other children, just like him, who were being helped through the Silent Light Fund. Mom, can I write a letter to that kid? Sarah turned to him, her eyes glistening. Of course. We'll write it together. That night, Ethan picked up a pen and, in shaky handwriting, wrote the first line. My name is Ethan. I used to be scared of everything, but it's better now. I think if you want, we could be friends. Sarah read it and didn't change a word. She just kissed his forehead. Outside, the nightlights stayed on, like the silent light that lives in each of us. It rained steadily all morning. Raindrops clung to the windowpane like whispers from a past no one could quite make sense of. In the second-floor apartment, where Ethan and Sarah were learning to live again after 5 fractured years, the soft glow from the ceiling light spilled over the wooden table where an old family photo sat, a fragment of memory that never fully healed. That day, Sarah received a letter with no return address. The envelope was smudged from water. Inside was a sheet of paper folded in half, the handwriting fine, slanted, but deliberate. It was from Marla, the woman who had helped Ethan make a phone call from the cabin deep in the woods. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I only want the boy to know I was wrong, but I tried to make it right. In that brief moment, I chose to let him call, even knowing the cost it would bring me. If I could live that day over, I'd do it sooner. Please take care of him. And if he ever wants to write back, I'll read it. Marla. Ethan held the letter, studying the handwriting. He said nothing for several minutes. Finally, he looked at his mother and asked, his voice barely more than a breeze across a quiet lake. Was she a bad person? Sarah didn't answer right away. She looked at him, then out at the rain-soaked window. She saved you, even after staying silent for a very long time. I don't know if she was good, but I do know this. You're here because of her. Ethan nodded. He didn't ask anything else. The days passed without major upheaval, but each moment carried a quiet kind of waiting, like a leaf longing for sunlight after the rain. There was no more running, no more frantic phone calls, or sleepless nights filled with the fear of not knowing. But peace, as it turned out, didn't come all at once. It settled slowly, like dust on a bookshelf, long untouched. Ethan began returning to school, not with the clamor of a comeback, but gently, like dipping his toes into water that still remembered the cold. At first, it was just him and Ms. Joyner, a soft-spoken counselor who met him in a quiet room at the community center twice a week. They didn't always dive into lessons. Some days, they just colored. Some days, they made up stories about animals that got lost in the woods but found their way back by listening to the wind. Miss Joyner never pushed. She only smiled and waited, letting silence do what words couldn't. After a few weeks, Ethan joined a small learning pod with 3 other kids, 2 girls and a boy, each carrying their own quiet stories. None of them asked Ethan why he was there. They shared colored pencils, traded stickers, and laughed at the way the therapy dog, Murphy, always snored through reading time. For Ethan, it was enough. It was something solid under his feet again. Sarah was always there, sitting in the waiting area just outside the frosted glass door. She brought a different book each time, novels she'd once meant to read back when her life was on pause in a very different way. But no matter the title, she never seemed to get past page 10. Her eyes would scan the words, but her ears stayed trained on the hallway, her heart tuned to the subtle rhythm of her son's healing. She didn't interrupt, didn't hover. She simply showed up, quietly, every time. Sometimes, while waiting, she would glance up from her unopened book to see Ethan through the small observation window. He would be bent over his notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration, or giggling when Murphy rolled over for a belly rub. And in those small glimpses, Sarah felt something beginning to uncoil inside her, something that had been wound too tight for too long. It wasn't quite relief. It wasn't yet joy. But it was the beginning of ease. One rainy afternoon in late autumn, the boy sat by the window, holding Peanut, the old cat now nearly 15. The cat rested his chin on Ethan's knee, lazy and content, as if the whole world were a dream yet to end. Sarah sat beside them, reading. The room was still, broken only by the turning of pages and the soft fall of rain. No one spoke, but peace filled the space, a peace deep enough for 2 mending souls to sit side by side without needing words to hold them together. That day's local paper carried a small piece on the culture page, not the front page, not bolded in headlines. The article was titled, "5 Years in the Woods, and the Return of a Small Light." No one was singled out as a hero. No one turned into a symbol. But every name was mentioned. Sarah, the mother who never gave up. Kevin, the young officer who believed in a 2 a.m. phone call. Lisa, the quiet therapist who helped replant words. And Ethan, the survivor who didn't need a medal. Sarah folded the paper and set it down. She got up and walked to the window, where Ethan still sat. Outside, the sky had darkened, but the light inside remained warm. She laid a hand gently on his shoulder, as if any sudden move might break this fragile calm. "It's getting cold. Let's close the window, sweetheart." Ethan didn't reply, but shifted slightly to let her draw closer. Sarah eased the window shut. The creaking hinge sounded like the end of a quiet song. The rain continued, but the room was warm now. Inside Sarah, the questions no longer boiled. She had stopped wishing for a perfect ending. She had learned to live with loss, the way people live with a scar, not something to erase, but something to live well alongside. That night, Ethan picked up his pen and wrote in his journal, the one he only shared with his mother. The handwriting was uneven, but the words were clear. "Today I thought about Miss Marla. I'm not mad at her. If she hadn't let me call, maybe I wouldn't be sitting here now. I don't know what forgiveness really means, but I think I'm okay." Sarah read it, then gently closed the notebook. She didn't need to teach her son what forgiveness was. He had found it, quietly, on his own. Night fell. Sarah blew out the living room lamp, leaving only the soft glow of the bedroom light stretching into the hallway. She stood at the doorway, watching Ethan curled up with his pillow, his eyes barely closed, his breathing steady. On the wall, the painting still hung. 2 houses, one in the forest, the other with a lit window. She walked over and kissed his forehead gently. "Sleep well, my love." Ethan turned slightly, but didn't open his eyes. His lips moved just enough to say, "I'm not afraid of the dark anymore, Mom." Sarah smiled. She turned off the last light. Outside, it was still raining, but inside their hearts, the light remained. Quiet, steady, never fading. And that was what mattered most. We have just walked through a journey full of shadows, and also full of light. Ethan's story isn't just about a boy kidnapped and found. It's about love, perseverance, and the capacity to forgive. Perhaps the hardest part isn't losing someone. It's not being believed when you're still searching for them. Have you ever felt that way? Walking through long, quiet years, holding on to nothing but a fragile hope. I don't know where you are or what you're going through, but if there's one thing I've taken from this story, it's this. Sometimes all it takes is a kind word, a patient look, and someone can find the strength to rise again. Do you believe forgiveness is always necessary? Or are there wounds better left untouched? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, if you're tired, rest a while. If you're lonely, at least here, you are not alone.